They were already planning to erase me. I just hadn't realized it yet. But I will tell you exactly the moment I did, and what I did next. I've lived in this house for 41 years, raised a family in it, buried a wife from it, and not once did I imagine that the person who would try to take it from me would be someone I fed at my own table when he was 12 years old. If you've ever felt invisible in a place you built, stay with me, because this story is about what happens when a man who has nothing left to prove decides he still has everything to protect. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 83 years old. I worked 37 years for the railroad, not in an office, not behind a window, out in the yards, supervising track crews in weather that would make younger men quit before noon. I know what it means to work with your hands until they crack in winter. I know what it means to come home so tired you fall asleep in your boots. I built a life the way men of my generation built things, slowly, carefully, without asking anyone to admire the process. When my wife Ruth passed 4 years ago, the house went quiet in a way I hadn't prepared for. Not silent, quiet. There's a difference. Silent is peaceful. Quiet is the absence of someone who used to fill the room. I'd come downstairs in the morning and stand at the kitchen window for longer than I should have, holding a mug that had gone cold while I watched the yard and thought about nothing and everything at the same time. The arthritis in my hands had gotten worse. My balance wasn't what it used to be. My doctor kept asking me if I had someone at home, and I kept telling him I was fine, because that's what I'd always said, and I didn't know how to stop. My nephew Dennis called in the spring, said he and his wife Carla were between places, said it would only be a few months, said it would be good for both of us. And I believed him, because I wanted company, and because I remembered the boy he used to be, the one who used to follow me around the workshop asking what everything was for. I thought I knew him. I thought that version of him still existed somewhere underneath the man he'd become. That was my first mistake. They moved in with more boxes than I expected. Carla was polite in the beginning, stiff but polite. She'd make dinner some nights and set a place for me at my own table like I was a guest. Dennis seemed distracted, always on his phone, always with one eye somewhere else. I told myself they were stressed. I told myself they were adjusting. I gave them the larger bedroom because it had better light, and I moved my things to the smaller room at the end of the hall without being asked, because that's the kind of man I'd always been, the kind who makes room. It started with small things, the kind of small things you're not sure you're allowed to mention because they seem so minor when you say them out loud. The mail would be on the counter one morning and gone by afternoon. I'd find drawers in my desk slightly out of place, not open, just shifted, like someone had gone through them carefully and pushed them almost all the way back, but not quite. I'd walk into the kitchen and a conversation would stop, not pause, stop. The way conversations stop when the person being talked about has just entered the room. Dennis would look at his phone. Carla would ask me if I wanted coffee, and her voice would be too cheerful, the way a voice gets when it's covering something. I told myself I was imagining it. At 83, you learn to question your own perceptions. The doctors have been doing it to you for years, asking if you're confused, if you've been forgetting things, slipping their questions in between the routine ones like they're checking for cracks. You start to wonder if maybe your mind is the problem, and not the world around you. But I'd spent 37 years supervising men who didn't want to be caught cutting corners. I knew what evasion looked like. I knew the difference between someone who was simply distracted and someone who was performing distraction. And slowly, quietly, I started paying attention in a different way. The first concrete thing I noticed was the bank statement. I get paper statements, always have, always will, and I keep them in the top drawer of my desk in the workshop. In March, the February statement wasn't there. I looked twice. I checked the drawer beneath it. I went through every folder on the shelf above. It was gone. I went to the bank in person that week and asked for a copy. The teller was kind. She printed it without asking questions. When I got home, I sat in my truck in the driveway and read through every line before I went inside. There were 3 withdrawals I didn't recognize. Not large. 200 here, 300 there. Amounts small enough to dismiss as a forgotten errand. But I hadn't made them. I knew my own patterns the way I knew the weight of a particular wrench. I knew what I spent and when. These withdrawals were not mine. I didn't say anything that night. I went inside, made my supper, watched the news, and went to bed. And in the dark, lying on my back staring at the ceiling I'd looked at for 41 years, I made a decision. I was going to watch. I was going to listen. And I was not going to give them the slightest indication that I had any idea what was happening. The humiliation began to escalate in ways that were harder to ignore. Dennis started managing my prescriptions. He said it was for convenience, that the pharmacy was on his way to wherever he was always going. But he started controlling when I took them, reminding me in front of Carla in a tone that implied I couldn't be trusted with my own medication. One evening I wanted to drive to the hardware store, a trip I'd made 100 times, and he took my keys off the hook by the door and said he'd take me when he had time. He handed them back only when I stood there long enough that refusing became uncomfortable for him. But the gesture had been made. The message had been sent. Carla was subtler. She'd referenced things I'd apparently said that I had no memory of saying. Not lies exactly, but distortions, slight reshapings of conversations that made me sound confused. She'd say, "Walter mentioned he wasn't sure about the insurance," or, "Walter said he'd been having trouble keeping track of things." She said these things to Dennis in my presence, as though I weren't there, as though my being in the room didn't require acknowledging. I was becoming furniture, old, inconvenient furniture that hadn't been moved yet. The workshop was the one place I had left. I'd go down in the evenings after supper and just sit among my tools, the smell of oil and old wood, the shelves exactly as I'd arranged them. I kept a locked cabinet in the back corner, a heavy steel thing I'd bolted to the wall years ago, where I stored property documents, my railroad pension papers, Ruth's life insurance settlement, a copy of my will. Things I'd kept organized and secured for decades. I'd check the cabinet every few days, not because I was anxious, because I was thorough. Thoroughness was how I'd survived 37 years of work that punished carelessness. One evening in late April, I went down to the workshop and found a scratch on the cabinet lock. Not deep, a faint lateral mark, like something had been inserted and moved. I crouched down and looked at it for a long time. My knees ached. I didn't care. I looked at that mark until I was certain it hadn't been there before, because I would have noticed it before, and I had noticed everything in that workshop for 4 decades. I said nothing. I went back upstairs. I poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window in the dark, the way I used to stand after Ruth died, and I thought carefully about what I needed to do next. The night I understood everything was a Tuesday in May. I'd gone to bed early, or made a show of it, and lay in the dark listening to the house settle the way old houses do. Around 11 I heard their voices from the kitchen below, low but continuous. I got up slowly, no lights, moved to the top of the stairs in my socks, and sat on the second step. I listened. It was Carla doing most of the talking. She said the attorney had confirmed the process. She said they needed one more signature and the transfer would be complete. She said the facility she'd found was 40 minutes outside of town, and that once Walter was placed, the sale could close within 60 days. She said Walter wasn't going to understand what was happening until it was already done. Dennis said something I couldn't fully make out, something that sounded like hesitation, and Carla said low and flat, "He's 83. By the time he figures it out, it won't matter." I sat on that step for a long time after they went to bed. I wasn't panicking. That surprised me. I thought I would panic, that some part of me would fracture at finally knowing what I'd suspected. But what I felt instead was something closer to clarity. The fog I'd been living in for months, the self-doubt, the wondering if I was imagining things, lifted completely. I could see the situation in its full shape now, and it was not complicated. They were going to take my house. They were going to put me somewhere and then sell the thing I had spent my life building, and they believed I was too old and too confused to stop them. They had never made a more consequential error. I started the next morning, not with confrontation. I have never solved anything useful through confrontation. I started with a phone call. I had kept a small address book in my jacket pocket for 30 years, the kind with the elastic band, and I found the number I was looking for on the third page. Margaret Osei. Her father had worked beside me for 11 years on the Northern Line. She'd been a girl when I knew him, and he'd told me once, with a pride that was almost embarrassing to witness, that she'd gone to law school. I'd kept her number because Earl had asked me to, said she was just starting out, and he wanted her to know good people. I'd never had reason to call. I had reason now. She answered on the second ring. I told her I needed help, and I told her why. I spoke plainly, no drama, no self-pity. I told her what I suspected, what I'd heard, and what I had in my files. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mr. Hayes, don't touch anything, don't move anything, and don't let them see that anything has changed. Can you do that?" I told her I'd been doing it for 2 months already. She said she'd come to the house on Saturday when she knew I'd be alone. What followed were 3 weeks of the most careful work I have done since I stopped going to work. Margaret came on Saturday, and we sat in the workshop with the door closed. She reviewed the property documents in the cabinet, which hadn't been accessed because I'd changed the lock the morning after I heard them on the stairs, and she photographed everything with her phone. I gave her the bank statements I'd been collecting, the reprinted ones from the bank and the new ones I'd been requesting weekly. She took notes in a small spiral pad without theatrics, without rushing. I continued living in the house exactly as I had been. I came to supper. I watched the evening news. I accepted the coffee Carlo offered with a too cheerful voice. I let Dennis drive me to the pharmacy. I asked no questions about my finances. I complained mildly about my knees. I was, as far as they could tell, the same confused, fading old man they'd been managing for months. It was the greatest performance of my life, and it cost me nothing, because I felt nothing but resolve. Margaret found 3 things that formed the architecture of what they had built. First, a power of attorney document bearing what appeared to be my signature, notarized by a notary public whose license she was able to check, and whose recent activity suggested a working relationship with a particular real estate attorney. Second, a letter to the county assessor's office referencing that power of attorney and initiating a title inquiry. Third, a pending sale agreement for my property contingent on clear title, with a closing date set for late June. They had a plan. It was a real plan, built by people who thought they had thought of everything. What they had not thought of was that the man they were planning around was still thinking. Margaret filed a legal hold on the title. She contacted the county clerk. She drafted a formal complaint to the state bar regarding the notary. She also helped me contact Adult Protective Services, not as a victim seeking rescue, I want to be clear about that, but as a property owner documenting an attempt at coercion and financial exploitation. I was not a man being saved. I was a man deploying the systems I was owed access to. On the 14th of June, Dennis received a certified letter at my address. I watched him sign for it from the kitchen doorway. I watched his face as he read the first page. It was the face of a man realizing that the floor he was standing on was not the floor he thought it was. He didn't say anything to me that night. Neither did Carla. We had supper in a quiet that was different from all the other quiets. This one belonged to me. The morning of the scheduled closing, the title company called to inform the buyer's agent that the transaction could not proceed. Margaret was on the phone with the county clerk simultaneously. By noon, the real estate attorney who had prepared the documents was under investigation. By the end of the week, Dennis and Carla had received formal notice requiring them to vacate the property within 30 days, with documentation that they had participated in an attempt to execute an unauthorized transfer of title. Several members of my extended family received a letter, not from me but as a matter of public record, that outlined what had been attempted. I did not write that letter. I did not need to. The facts wrote it themselves. They were gone in 3 weeks. Dennis made one attempt to speak to me before he left. He stood in the doorway of the workshop, and I was at my workbench, not looking up. He said my name once. I let it sit in the air. Then I said, "Leave your keys on the hook." He did. I heard the front door close. I set down what I was holding, and I sat for a while in the smell of oil and old wood, in the room where I had kept every document that had protected me, and I breathed. There are no dramatic conclusions to offer. I am still 83 years old. My hands still ache in the cold. My balance is still unreliable. The house is still quiet, in the way that houses are quiet when the person who filled them is gone. I still stand at the kitchen window some mornings with a mug gone cold, thinking about Ruth, thinking about the years that passed here and the years still ahead of me, however many they are. But something has changed, not something dramatic, something structural. I restructured every account with Margaret's guidance. I formalized my will with a different attorney and filed a copy with the county. I installed a camera at the front door and a lock on the workshop that uses a code only I know. I made a list of the people I actually trust, and I made sure those people know how to reach Margaret if anything ever happens to me. I did not become bitter. I did not become afraid. I became organized in a way I should have been years earlier, and I felt no shame in that. Dignity is not preserved by trust alone. It is preserved by the willingness to act when that trust is broken. The workshop is still mine. The tools are still where I put them. The cabinet is still bolted to the wall, and what's inside it is secure in ways it wasn't before. Legally, structurally, formally. I go down there most evenings. I sit in the chair by the workbench and I think about the things I've built and fixed and kept over the years. I think about what it means to maintain something, to check on it, to notice when something is slightly off, to act before the damage becomes permanent. That is what I did, and I would do it again. I am still here. That is not a small thing. If you have someone in your life who needs to hear this, share it with them. And if this is the first time you've found me, don't go yet. There is more to tell.